Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending upon when you're watching this, students. We are now moving into the next part of these Learn lectures, and we're going to be talking about, within regards to application and methods, we're going to start talking about research design. My apologies on that. So let's get right into it, or jump into it for lack of better terminologies. So we learned in previous module that we can do research that seeks explanations that are either idiographic or nomothetic, right? Idiographic explanations attempt to fully understand a limited situation or cases. For instance, when a child or children are found that have been isolated or treated poorly by their parents, social scientists and medical professionals may attempt to study their specific cases to understand completely about the children's social, psychological, and physical development. We would never ethically consider another type of research study that attempts a nomoethic explanation, right? Such as through an experiment of isolated children's development versus a control group of children who are not isolated. This is one example where idiographic explanation of a particular case is the best way to produce an understanding of this phenomena. So it takes into consideration how we have to make sure to be very careful on how we gain our insights, right? So gaining insights from a cult and how they recruit or retain their members would be another study aimed at idiographic explanation. Studying everything about the people who live there would be idiographic. When conducting studies that seek nomoethic explanations, we are typically, I apologize, aimed at larger numbers within our study, and we are not out to understand fully why something happens. Instead, we are aware that our results will be probabilistic. We are seeking regularities and not necessarily an all or nothing finding. We do not need 100% of the findings to come to our conclusions that one variable causes another one, or the IV or DV, independent variable impacting the dependent variable. There are three main criteria for nomoethic causality. There are the three main criteria for the nomoethic causality, as I said, took place. We have the correlation, time order, and non-spurious. The variable must be correlated, right? The cause must take place before the effect, and the variables have a non-spurious relationship. Correlation means that there's already a relationship between two variables such that change in one are associated with change in the other, and attributes of one are associated with attributes of the other. Correlation does not constitute a causal relationship between the variables, but is one of the criteria of causality. Time order is important when considering our independent and dependent variable connection. The cause, or the independent variable, must come before what is affected or what has affected the dependent variable. So let's say that we have a hypothesis that states young people are more likely than older people to engage in risk-taking behavior. Now, in this situation, age is the independent variable that causes the risk-taking behavior. Remember, in nomoethic explanations, we are not looking for 100% causality. We do not need all young people and no old people to engage in or not engage in risky behavior. We are studying whether younger people are more likely to do so. So if our findings do, in fact, show a regularity that compared to older people, younger ones are more likely to engage in risky behavior, we can say that age is a factor. So this is something to kind of take into consideration, right? Like we are looking at how these things work. So we are not looking for total causation, but rather expectations are expected. And the causal relationship doesn't even have to apply to the majority of the cases. It could be that most people in our study that we have hypothetically given, don't engage in risky behaviors at all. But the ones who do are more likely young than old. So the third requirement is non-spuriousness. A spurious relationship is one that is not genuine, but rather coincidental correlating between two variables, which is usually being caused by a third variable that hasn't been included in the study. Now, Babby's example of shoe size having a positive correlation with math skills is quite humorous, as we know that a person's size of their shoe is not a real cause for their math skills, and math skills also have nothing to do with affecting shoe size. Instead, age is the third variable that is causing both shoe size to grow and math skills to get better. So, as clearly there is no genuine correlation between the number of Nicolas Cage movies and the number of drownings in pools, although this graph and I'll kind of get to here, is kind of funny when we start looking at this regards, right? That you'll see these different causations. If it's spurious, non-spurious, or looking at the amount of people on here on the bottom, as you can see, the number of people who drowned by falling into a pool during the Nicolas Cage. These are also fascinating types of situations. And as I just said, clearly there's no genuine correlation. So it is important when reviewing other people's findings, right? And our own and of our own course, that we critically think about how the variables connect and if there is a relationship is genuine or if something else could be involved that explains the correlation. We are also looking for necessary and sufficient causes. Having both is more satisfying outcome for the research, but is generally not obtained in a nomoethic explanations because of a variability of complexities of the people and the events we study. If we can find some of the reasons to explain our research questions, we are going in the right direction. Now, some of these things in here are rather interesting, as I mentioned, right, with the Nicolas Cage, looking at shoe size, all these different situations. Another one for you to kind of wrap your head around is something I talk about in my intro classes, which is there is correlation and causation, right? That's kind of what we're covering here. And one of the more interesting facts is that murder rates in the summer go up, right? It's very common. You'll see that if you look at data. And in some cases, in most cases, actually, ice cream sales go up in the summer. So if we're basing it on just the basis, then you would be able to say, if this wasn't the case, that murder rates increase when ice cream sales go up. But it just has to do with the independent dependent variable that in the summer, people buy more ice cream. And in the summer, more people are out and about. So there tends to be a higher rate of murder. So there ends up being a situation that causes this. And so we start seeing how spurious and non-spurious is important. So like we said, if we find the data in our research question, we are going in the right direction. Now, a necessary cause is a condition that must be present for the effect to happen. It must be present. Having female sex organs is a necessary cause for getting pregnant, yet a sufficient cause is a condition that guarantees the effect in question. Having female sex organs is not a sufficient cause for getting. Having female sex organs is not a sufficient cause for getting pregnant. Otherwise, if all females would get pregnant. So next up, let's consider our unit of analysis in research design. Who or what do we want to study? The unit of analysis is what or who we are studying. In the social sciences, we often study individuals, yet we can also have many other units of analysis instead, right? To understand the unit of analysis for your study or one that you are reading, ask yourself who or what has the variable in question. Younger people are more likely to engage in risky behaviors than older people. Who has behavior? People do. Our unit of analysis is the individual people. We can also study groups of people instead of individuals. For instance, we might want to study families as our unit of analysis. So we are going to collect data on 1,000 families across the United States to see how they have handled the COVID-19 pandemic. So when we think about this, we start using this idea of the unit of analysis, as you can see on your slides now. So we'll study those families, right? If our study is collecting the whole family unit's responses as one, and we are comparing each family unit to the other families, family would be our unit of analysis. We could end up with an ecological fallacy if we reported our findings at the family level and make assumptions about the individuals within. So if our unit of analysis is a group, we can only make assumptions at a group level and can't explain what is happening with the individual within that group. So if we got the data where families with young children had more difficulties than families with older children, we can't say that young children were feeling the most difficulties. It could be the parents of those children, but we wouldn't know unless we studied those parents, and with children at that level. So it becomes important how we do our unit of analysis. So we do not want to be in a situation where we do an ecological fallacy. We have to have a hypothesis. We have to use reductionism. We have to understand who we're analyzing, right? So we go down that path. Now, we can study non-humans. I had an instructor in my undergraduate days who was doing her research on news reporting of men and women's sports. My mentor also had this. The time spent on news coverage of men's v women's sports was recorded. My instructor had a stopwatch and would mark down how many seconds were given to men's and women's sports on the news. So if the variable in the time recorded is the time recorded, who or what has the variable, right? The news reports would be the unit of analysis here. In addition to the ecological fallacy, where we may facilitate come to a conclusion, right, about individuals within the group or the unit of analysis, we can also fall into the faulty reasoning of reductionism. This is when our explanation is too limited. So we get into the situations when we reduce something to a simple explanation when in reality, we are dealing with something much more complex. This is a big one for us because we often do not have one simple cause for a social phenomenon. People in society are much more complex, so we must choose a unit of analysis that will allow us to analyze the complexities. Another consideration when designing research is to choose what type of study is necessary for your research question. How important is time? Does your research question ask about what happens over a period of time? Is collecting your data over one point in time sufficient to come to the conclusions you're looking for? Cross-sectional studies and other ways of doing analysis are important for us to take into consideration when we're doing these types of works, right? So another type of situation, like I just said, is that your research question asks about what happens over that time. So cross-sectional studies are those where you take observations of a sample or a cross-section of a population or a social phenomenon that are made at one point in time. As a former director of a market research company, cross-sectional data was quintessential to our deliverable goods to many nonprofit organizations doing survey research on their member and database at one point in time. To measure the satisfaction, for an example here, we would do large studies to see how the donors were donating, right? If we were to scale and look at how the impact of the product changes or happiness over time, this would be a longitudinal study, and we did them on a regular basis, one that carried out at a different moments in time to make observations over an extended period of time. This was also a tool we offered, as I just mentioned, but the effort, resources, and time commitments to it came at a different and more expensive prices, which was a variable in the marketing world to consider, but it provided a different measurement of success than a cross-sectional study. So longitudinal, cross-section, various ways that you can approach data collection and methods. So this became a big deal. It became a big deal of understanding how we do these different processes. Do we need to do a trend studies, a cohort studies, a panel studies, a cross-sectional, a longitudinal? These are things you'll be doing in the real world. There are a few different types of longitudinal studies that we can conduct, as you see on your slide and I just mentioned. And these are trend studies, very common in market research, and are those that examine changes within a population over time. This would be what we're looking at when we're looking at satisfaction. So while on the US Census from 1 year would be a cross-sectional study, if we compare the US Census over a period of multiple decades, that would be a trend study. Cohort studies examine specific subpopulations or cohorts as they change over time. So if we were to follow the millennial generation to see how their ideas and behaviors change over time, that would be a cohort study. This is used by many companies to track generational trends to know how to better market to generations and focus points. A panel study, on the other hand, is when you follow the same set of people over time. The exact same people would be interviewed, surveyed repeatedly over a period of agreed upon time. So the following kids from the specific families to see how they develop over the years would be a panel study. Many TV shows have made this their brand or their bread and butter. They use it to point out check-ins and references many times that they find that the viewers enjoying seeing change over time. There was a huge movie that spanned over 30 years to look at how we would check in, right? So as you can imagine, elements of your own ideas for research and study, think about how you might want to choose the design that will allow you to answer the question that you have about social life, because this comes into play every single time. Do you want to study a group of period over time? Do you want to do a panel study? Do you want to do a cohort study? Are you going to ask Nomoethic? Or are you going to ask what types of questions are you going to do? What is your hypothesis? These are things you need to start thinking about and really kind of break into what you want to cover and what you want to study. As always, I will see you in the next lecture, and I look forward to discussing measurements with you next. I'll take care and I'll see you in the next lecture.